through the journey. That's very nice to see. These are always kind of bittersweet kinds of things when you spend a lot of time with a person in a project and part of their growth and development. Jacob's kind of an icon of sorts in terms of the tenure that he's been here in Hays. Again, hearing some stories and again, familiar with many of these. He started, in the community and particularly at Sternberg at a foundational level and really moved rather kind of rapidly into opportunities to docent and do research in summer camps and a lot of things like that with our late friend Curtis Schmidt. It's a big part of that growth and development. And so it's only natural that he would come to Fort Hays and work on his bachelor's degree in secondary education, given his interaction at the museum and those sorts of experiences. He graduated in May 2021 and jumped right in to teach 7th grade science and found out that, he has a skill set that maybe is better suited to other things. And that's the way I'll describe it. He does have passions for technology, for natural resources, and sharing that gift in combination. And so in 2023, he approached me and said, Dr. Stark, what do you think about this kind of a project? And it's very different than kinds of things that we usually do. But with committee's help and things like that, I think we've arrived at a kind of an interesting outcome here. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jacob and let him share what he's been developing over the last couple of years.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here. I mean, it's really it's genuinely touching to have everybody here today. It's been quite the journey to get here, like Dr. Stark had said, and he might have even spoiled a little bit of this oh no, technology. There we go. He might have even spoiled a little bit of this first slide for me. But so like Dr. Stark said, I had kind of an interesting journey to get where I am, and I've been able over the years to wear a couple different hats, and hats that I really have enjoyed and have kind of directed me to a more focused passion in life. And so the first of which was biology. So my undergraduate degree is in biology, and I got the opportunity to work for a lot of different state and federal agencies, doing professional biology out in the field, recording data and doing the real work. And while I was doing that, I also kind of had this passion for informal education. And so through the Sternberg Museum, I went all over the state teaching different communities about reptiles and amphibians and natural history. I also have had the opportunity to take students from the Sternberg science camps down to Arizona and New Mexico for a week-long trip to actually have them participate in some of the field work that scientists around the US were doing. And then I kind of came to a point where I was like, all right, well, I've done this stuff. I'm about to graduate. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do after this? And I had this real love for this informal education. And I thought, well, if I can make a difference by teaching others, why not do it in one of the best settings there is, which is K through 12 education. You impact a wide-ranging demographic of students, and you have really a captive audience. And so that's where I made the leap into K through 12 education and started teaching 7th grade science at Hays Middle School here in town. And like Dr. Stark said, wasn't exactly the right fit for me. There were some elements I really, really loved, and there were some elements I did not like so much. And so I decided to step away from the K through 12 and get my master's here with this project, which is a combination of all three of these hats. And so one thing that all of these experiences taught me is there's a really weird and interesting relationship between humans, nature, and media. And so what we're seeing is that there is a shift towards a digital delivery of information. Everybody's on their devices, right? We have some people that are here because of devices, and really everybody's just consuming more digitally. And then we also see that there is a drastic reduction in nature-based recreation. So this has been found with a couple different studies over the years. During COVID, there was a kind of an uptick in recreation, but that's because we didn't have anything else to do but go outside. But it's kind of leveled back off. And then we also see that by 2050, about 65% of the global population is going to be living in urban areas. And it's really this kind of perfect storm of we're moving away from nature-based recreation, we're living in areas that are farther away from nature, and we're spending more time on devices. And as a science educator, as a K through 12 educator, these are realistically hurdles that we have to accept, adapt to, and overcome if we want to be able to make an impact. And so where do we, excuse me, so there are some, maybe? There we go. So there are some silver linings here. Education and conservation have a really good relationship together. So what we see is that as there are direct and intentional education efforts of natural resources, the conservation perspectives tend to increase, which is great for us. And it's sort of this idea of deep ecology in a way. The more time that you spend in the outdoors and the more time that you learn about these resources, the more likelihood that there is that you'll want to conserve them. You kind of feel indebted to these natural resources. And I think this is a really great example, this photo. So this comes from an event called Fish Wizards in the Flint Hills. And this young man's probably never going to forget this day in his life, where a bunch of crazy people came with nets and pulled really colorful fish out of his backyard stream that he did not know existed until that moment. And then they told him about how important they are to his surroundings. And that's really impactful, and that's going to stick with this kid. And I think deep down, as educators, that's really what we want to do, is we want to have somebody care even a fraction of the percent that we do about our given area. For me, it's natural resources. And so where do we start? For me, it starts at Fort Leavenworth Military Reservation. So if you're unfamiliar, it's located in northeast Kansas along the Missouri River. And if you really don't know about Kansas, it's that part that somebody took a bite out of, right, the rough corner. So that's where we're at. The base itself was established in 1827 and is one of the longest running military installations west of the Mississippi. And there are some really interesting forests of significance here. We have an oak hickory upland forest and a pecan cottonwood sycamore floodplain forest. And these forests are some of the last remaining old growth forest in Kansas, so they're significant. Maybe. Here's a little bit better look at the upland forest. So you can see that there's quite a lot of large trees. The upland forest, we would kind of describe it as having some steep topography. And from my perspective, there are quite a few different trails that can be recreated on here. So it's important in that fashion. And you can see some of the trails. Right here's one, and we're actually driving along one here. The floodplain forest then is a little bit different. There are a few trails here, but they're not as recreated, mostly because there's kind of an access issue. It's sort of out on the outskirts of base, as well as this is the only area where there is rifle hunting a few times a year. So there's about 5 weekends where there's rifle hunting here. And so people do hike on these trails, but not quite as frequently. From a topographical standpoint, it's relatively flat. It is a true floodplain. It does flood every once in a while. And there are some particularly giant trees down here. So what you're looking at here is the state champion pecan tree. And honestly, the projection's almost right that that's like the actual size there. And so Dr. Stark and I have about a 6-foot wingspan apiece, and we're just barely making it around this thing. So there are some really impressive trees that tell interesting stories. Some of these pecans are actually ones that Lewis and Clark either saw or descendants of the ones that Lewis and Clark saw on their westward journey. But besides hugging trees with my bestie, why am I here? You know? So it really comes down to this thing called the Sykes Act. So the Sykes Act basically says that military installations with significant natural resources need to maintain and manage those resources. So our 2 forests, they're old growth forests in Kansas, and they're significant. So it falls into that category. And luckily, there's federal funding to be able to do that. And there's an opportunity for some funding for educational resources that also supports that Sykes Act. When we look at Fort Leavenworth as a community, it has about 6,000 to 7,000 residents. And what's interesting about it is it's home to the Command and General Staff College. So it very much is like its own small college community. And a portion of that population rotates through about every 6 to 9 months. So it's continually refreshing. And we also have a little bit of international representation with some joint work. And because it's its own small little community, there's 4 K through 9 schools on base for the residents to send their children to. So the why is really this perfect storm of having a very amazing, significant natural resource, having the federal funding to be able to support a project, and having a captive audience to give that project to. And not only a captive audience, but one that will never hit a saturation point with all of the information, because it's continually refreshing. So it's sort of akin to like a national park or a state park where you have new visitors every cycle. There we go. So then what is the project? Realistically, in a nutshell, the project is to provide an expansive, diversive, and immersive educational resource for every resident on base or any visitor on base. And not only that, but provide local educators with lesson plans to support them. And so it looks a little something like this. We have an audience, and we want to cast a wide net to capture that audience. And the way we do that is with different multimedia elements. And so each one of these elements can stand alone and be its own educational resource, but very much like a net, they're interconnected and work together even better. And so the story kind of goes something like this. A frog walks into the forest. And this frog is any one of those 6,000 to 7,000 residents, and they're hiking along some of those hiking trails. And they come across one of these beautiful handmade bronze plaques that has a QR code. And if they scan that QR code, it takes them to a website. Alternatively, they could have been given or found one of the brochures or landing signs that we're also making that have QR codes that lead to that same website. And that's how we catch them, is taking them to this website. And that's the hub. So this website, again, has access points to the plaques. There are 12 of those bronze plaques, and they're going to be strategically placed on base in some of the high use areas so that it catches your eye and you actually want to scan it. We also have brochures that are being made for a couple of the green spaces that will be handed out and potentially in some of the kiosks. We have landing signs, which give an overview of the project and have a description of some of the elements and have QR codes that lead to the website. And then Fort Leavenworth does a really good job at advertising different engagement for people on base. So they have all sorts of recreation that happens throughout the year, and they send that out in different publications to get people involved. And so if our project kind of aligns with that, there is some potential that they could advertise it through some of those channels. So we have this really great access point for different people to get into the project. What's offered then is really expansive and really in-depth. So we have tree educational videos, species-specific profile pages, next-generation science standard mini lessons, virtual hikes in 360 degrees, and long-term 360-degree videos, and some maps as well. And so each of these elements, again, can stand on their own as an educational resource, but they work really well together. And so I'll talk about them a little bit more specifically so you can get a better understanding of how each one kind of stands on its own. So for the educational videos and species profiles, we've chosen trees that have significant ecological importance on base. And what we do is we tell kind of a story, we tell a story with those trees to give a broader ecological concept idea to the people that are consuming these videos. And so when you scan one of these plaques or you scan one of the QR codes that are found around base, it takes you to a page that looks like this. Oh, too far, you weren't supposed to see that. So we have the web page. If you happen to be on a desktop, this is kind of what it would look like. But really, this is sort of what it will look like. This is the mobile version. And you'll notice that there's a video on top, and then there's some text underneath. And so that video has all of the information that the text does, but the text might have like a little bit more just because it's hard to fit everything into a video. And so the videos, for example, look a little something like this. This is a little bit of a one. These sprawling branches, more so than most of the other oak species. Their leaves are simple and alternate and lack bristles because they're in the white oak group. They have 3 to 4 lobes on each side and can be 6 to 12 inches in size. So that's an excerpt from the oak video. And so each of the videos and each of the textual information sections have these 3 parts. We have general information, which is basically what you've just heard, right? It's the what is it? How do I know that that is an oak tree? It's because of the leaves, because of the bark, some of the other elements. And so that's kind of surface level information. But then we get to the natural histories where we tell that broader ecological concept story. So we go from, that's an oak tree, I know it's an oak tree because the leaves look like this, the bark looks like this, and we take it and becomes, these trees are really important on an ecosystem level because they produce fruit, and those fruit have impact on things that eat them. And some years they produce more, and some years they produce less, and that has entire ecosystem level impacts. So we're adding depth to the knowledge of the user. And then at the very end, we have historical and indigenous uses. So a lot of the times, humans are very curious about how does this affect me? What is my personal relationship with this tree? And providing the historical and indigenous uses kind of gives that context. So that's how the educational videos are set up. And with those educational videos, then we can apply some mini lessons. So these mini lessons are tied to next generation science standards, which are the national science standards. And admittedly, I'm not great with elementary education, so I've taken them from grades 2 to 12. That's where I feel comfortable making material. And these lessons can be used by educators to supplement their own lessons. So say, for instance, a teacher has a gap in their unit. They have like a half a day or a day. They're like, man, what am I going to do with this day? They can hop on here and find one of those mini lessons, and they go, oh, great, I can fill my gap with these mini lessons. Alternatively, they can kind of do it in the reverse way, where I want to build a unit, and I want the forest to be the focus because we have this ecology unit, and they can go on and use these lessons to start building out that unit. So it can kind of go both ways. And if you're unfamiliar with NGSS standards, this is what they look like. It's kind of intimidating, but realistically, it's pretty simple. So up top is that lesson that standard that came from the last slide. The highlighted word is develop. So each one of these standards has sort of a word that tells the instructor what the students need to be doing. And this one's develop, more specifically, develop a model, simple model. And so the lesson would look like this. Students are shown real-life examples of seed dispersal. Ideally, we want that instructor to take those students out into the forest to be able to see that in real life, because that has the most impact. But it can happen in the classroom as well. After they're observing those examples, then they are given various household items back in the classroom to construct their own seed to be dispersed by an artificial animal. So like a garden glove is a really good example of that. After they test it, they've made those observations of whether their seed was successful or not, and then they can reflect on those observations and sort of draw conclusions. And so it looks like this. We have the actual observed natural seed that students are gaining biological knowledge on. And then they're taking that knowledge, those observations, and they're applying it to their own seed. And this is really great from a K through 12 educator standpoint, because there's a big push for cross-cutting concepts, which basically just means that content areas need to overlap in some way, because it's important to add some depth to the knowledge. And so this is not only using observational skills in biology, but it's using principles of engineering to be able to make that seed. And so we have some cross-cutting concepts here. So that's the mini lessons. So 360 is, I think, maybe the first novel thing of the project. Like everything else has been done in some way, and I might be doing it a little bit different, but this is one thing that I think is truly different and could be a very good tool for educators. So if you're unfamiliar with 360 videos, basically the cameras kind of work like this. We have two half spheres that are 180. So we have two lenses, two sensors, and then software stitches it together into a 360-degree sphere. And then the user's able to manipulate that sphere themselves. And that's kind of confusing, so here's an example. So this is from one of the long-term monitoring sites. And you can see that I'm manipulating the environment in 360. I can choose what I'm looking at. So I can zoom in and actually get a pretty good amount of definition on some of those leaves. I can zoom out. But I'm choosing what I want to look at, and I'm engaging with that space. And that's really important in terms of education, because choice really motivates students. Now, the reason that we did some of these 360 videos long term, we have 3 sites. We have 2 in the upland and 1 in the floodplain. The reason that we did this is to give perspective to individuals on base and to students, to show changes over time. Right? A certain set of that population is coming through. They might not see fall, they might not see winter. And so being able to give that perspective is really important. And so that's what we're trying to do with the 360 long-term sites, is show that perspective, show changes over time. We can then take that stationary and put it in motion to give a 360-degree virtual hike. So this hike is in western Kansas in some chalk formations. And the real key to these 360-degree hikes is being able to add that immersive audio, which of course is a little quiet. So you can hear the wind, you hear the crunching underneath your feet, and this sort of tricks the brain to feel like you're there. And it's not a replacement for going on a hike, but it does a pretty good job. And so the really cool thing about these 360-degree hikes is it's great for accessibility, right? If you have financial or travel means that you can't reach this area, you can sort of go there in 360 virtually. It's also great for students and individuals with disabilities, right? We're working on a military base. There's individuals that might have disabilities that can't have them access these trails. So this can stand in for that. It's obviously not a one-to-one replacement, but it really does a great job. And so that's what we're trying to do with these 360-degree hikes. If we take these hikes then a little bit further, we can add some information into them and we can turn them into a quiz. Sorry, it's a little glitchy there. It'll smooth out. It'll smooth out. And so we can turn them into a tree identification hike. So not only now are we just exploratory, we're asking individuals to engage with the material. We're asking them a question. So as they're walking along, eventually they're going to get prompted for a mystery tree. And that mystery tree will show up in 3, 2, 1. Quick quiz, what tree is that? Shagbark hickory is correct. You can tell because of the bark. So what we're doing is we're able to stop the video, get a stationary video that gives a little bit more clarity, and the student can zoom in and look at the different features along this tree that gives them an indication of what its identity is. And the really cool thing about this is it's a great example of showing that interconnectedness of the project. So if this was the first video you saw from my project, you'd be like, I don't know what that tree is. I've never been to Eastern Kansas. I've only seen like 3 trees in my life. And so you're like, I don't know, what do I do? And then you can go on the website, right? This is hosted on the website. You can go out and look at those other educational resources and learn about, oh, well, I know now that this is a shagbark hickory because I watched that one video or I read that one piece about hickories. And so it's great in that way, but it's also great to test the knowledge. So if they consumed all of the educational materials first, this is how they apply that knowledge and can test to see if they actually were really engaging with the materials. So it's a really great tool for that. The last 360 example is if we take from like an exploratory to direct interpretation. So we can add in somebody in the video with a microphone that's talking about the things that are happening in that 3-dimensional space. And so here's an example from a collections tour in the zoological collections. This was done in partnership with Bio 180, who historically has gone on collections tours with their students. And occasionally there's students that either are like sick or at athletics or just can't make it out to the museum. So this was to supplement that. And so they can get a real idea in 360 what those collections look like. And so here's a little bit, I should probably get on the audio. Here's a little bit of that video. And some of the things that might be written on this, if we take mammals, for an example, might be hind foot length, ear length, tail length, and any kind of other information that might be important to scientists. This information is also cataloged on that digital database that I talked about earlier. And it sticks with the specimen for its entire life. The same number, same information is constantly following the specimens around collection. So again, we're adding an extra layer into the 360. So not only are we exploring, we're able to explore that 3-dimensional space, but we're either passively or actively giving that person the information, right? So if we're a student, I might be looking at the hawks on top and kind of distracted visually, but they're still hearing that auditory information, and they might be passively getting it. Or they might be actively engaging with listening while also looking around in space and looking to where they are being prompted to look. So it's kind of an integration of getting really good high-grade information while being able to choose what you want to look at, which is, again, a very large piece of education. So how then do we construct these 360 videos? So kind of the first thing, at least one on the hikes, is to take the camera and just kind of walk along the area. And so walk just at like a normal pace, and that gets the video. And so when you do that, the audio is pretty bad. Like the cameras don't do a great job at audio. So what you have to do then is go back and record the footsteps, record the ambient noises with the microphone. And if you leave this out, it really brings people out of the video because your brain knows what's supposed to be, what it's supposed to sound like to walk in a forest, right? You know that there's supposed to be some crunching underneath your feet. And so adding that back in really brings in an immersive aspect. Once we've got the video and the audio recorded, take it into Premiere Pro, which is an editing software, and mix it all together and make sure all the audio levels are correct, like your footsteps aren't too loud, you can hear the birds okay, and then you have your product. So some possibilities of 360, right? So it's pretty obvious some of these educational opportunities that I've talked about so far, but some of the maybe not so obvious ones are things like showcasing ongoing research. So if you have 360-degree elements to your research, if you have some people working here, but some people are also working over there simultaneously, you can show that in 3-dimensional space without having to shoot traditional video here and then go back and shoot traditional video here. You give that spatial relationship. It also is great for demonstrating scientific operations. So this lower video here is an iron pour actually over in the foundry. And so when things go wrong, when things go sideways, people's jobs change, right? So they had a job, they knew where they needed to be, but the situation changes. Now I have to go do something different. I have to work with that. And so it's a really good opportunity to show students where they need to be in space for different lab activities, making sure that we know where they need to be for safety. And you can bring them up to speed in an environment that isn't dangerous, and you can be more confident that your student knows physically where they need to be in the actual space. So I think that's a really good utility there. So this is where I kind of take a weird turn. So medal in the arm, medal in the project. This is the story of the plaques. And so it goes back all the way to 2012. My very good friend Cooper Flores, I convinced him to go on a bike ride, and it went a little sideways. So here's the video. Maybe. Here's the video. Oh, no. Eventually, it'll be a video. There we go. Or not. All right. So pretend he crashes and then breaks his arm. So Cooper, his dad is Toby Flores, and Toby is the medals instructor here. And so I became really good friends with Toby along the years that I was friends with Cooper. And I had this idea one year to make belt buckles out of freshwater mussels. They're like the right size. They're like the right shape. They're cool. Nobody really knows about them. It's like flashy, cool belt buckle. And so we worked together on this, and we produced a few, and it's really where I had like this click moment of we can use metal casting to show delicate things in biology in a really unique way. And so that's where the plaques came in. We were looking for a way to get the public to access the project. And the plaques really made sense to me, right? I can show physically what the tree is looking like at all points of the year. It's flashy, it's really understandable, and it's really readable, right? If you're a toddler that can't read yet, you can walk up to the sign and know what's happening. It's a tree. You see the leaf, you see the acorns, you understand it. And so it was a really obvious choice, and also a very fun part for me and quite time consuming. It's about 13 hours per plaque to produce. And the steps go a little something like this. So we start off with the fruit that was collected in Leavenworth. Oh, going too fast. And we pour them in silicone to make silicone molds. Once we have the silicone mold, we take the fruit out and we can infill with wax, and that wax will eventually become the metal. We then put it in on top of this custom-made rubber stamp. And is this connecting some dots for you, Diana, with some weird stuff that I've ordered? Yeah, okay. So we have rubber stamps, which is like, why did you order those? This is why. So we glue the fruit onto that, and then I take real collected and pressed leaves. I paint the back with wax to give them a little depth and actually glue that on as well. We then add in some sand that has a binder in it, so it becomes hardened. And we make a two-part sand mold, so you can imagine at that line is where they come apart. We take everything out, which creates the negative space to infill the metal. So we then put it in the pit, and we pour it in metal. Maybe. There we go. So these aren't my molds, but they're a little bit more flashy and understandable. So we pour the molten metal in. The next day, we crack open those molds, and we get something that looks like this on the left. So not very pretty. We have to cut off some of the extra metal, sandblast it, and then we further refine it to eventually create these beautiful plaques. So that's the story of the plaques. Maybe too far. There we go. And here's a couple other things that I've done. They're out here on the table. Some skull work and a couple other little trinkets. It's really interesting to be able to make these long-lasting pieces that show the detail and can be handled with kind of reckless abandon without having to worry too much. So we're kind of rounding the corner here. Some impacts and importance of the project. There are definitely some local impacts that we hope the project has. The first of which is just increase those conservation perspectives, right? We want people to engage with the project, understand and listen and consume all of the different media types, and be able to have a deeper understanding and a deeper connection with the wilderness that they're living in. And along with that, we want to give a sense of place. So some of these individuals are coming from places like Western Kansas or even California, and so the environment looks a lot different, and they don't have a lot of time to get up to speed on where they're at. And so having a project like this that's very easily consumable, and it's kind of quick information in some cases, gives a sense of place to some of these people that are coming from far away. And then support local educators in lesson building. This is something I'm really passionate about. Being able to provide these local educators with really professional level information and content that they might not be as familiar with is really helpful to be able to build these impactful lessons. From a broader impact kind of perspective, it's a template for agencies to be able to use, right? So if you were an agency and you had a conservation goal, you could apply these concepts to your goal and be able to reach your audience really well. And it's endlessly expandable and collapsible, and it has some success. And I know this because I worked on a really successful campaign during this project with Kansas Herb Society. So this is the KHS beer. If you know anything about KHS, the lore, they're quite a thirsty bunch. They love an alcoholic beverage. So it made a lot of sense for when Dr. Stark was the president to come up with a collaborative beer. But we didn't just want to make a beer because that's kind of boring. We wanted to tell the story of a species. And we picked the Chihuahuan green toad, which probably less than 100 people ever have seen in the wild in Kansas, and it's a threatened species in the state. And so we wanted to tell a little bit about the natural history, like that they use ephemeral pools that are often bison wallows to breed in, and they hang out in them. And so we wanted to tell that story graphically to an audience that would understand that. And we had really good success in social media engagement on Instagram and a couple other places with some of the media that came out of this. So this is from the beer canning. And this video got about 2,700 views. There's a longer version too that actually tells the story. There we go. And so along with the beer can itself, we were able to make some t-shirts, which have a kind of a mishmash story to them. But we made some t-shirts, and we also made t-shirts of zoological collection specimens. And so the idea behind this is that those individuals who buy these t-shirts can go out into their communities and tell these conservation stories, tell the story about why zoological collections are important, tell the story about the Chihuahuan green toad and how it's an important species, even if you don't know about it. And it's a really successful thing. We had the cans just for the KHS, but if we were to do it again, we could expand this to their distribution range, add a QR code, and have something very similar to the project that I did with the trees with the toads. And this is successful, and we know this is successful because at the same time we were making our beer, the state of Nebraska, their Game and Parks was making their Slowpoke tangerine cider. And this had a really, really good response from the public in Nebraska, and they had a really successful campaign with this. So it just goes to show that the elements of my project, if they were applied, which mine is being applied in Fort Leavenworth, but if they're applied on a broader scale, have really good opportunities for success. And so we're rounding the last corner. So this is the takeaways. This is the too long don't read. If you fell asleep, this is the slide to pay attention to. We got to meet students in the public where they're at, and that is the reality of being an educator in today's world. We unfortunately have to meet them at a digital means in a lot of cases. We want to get them out into the wild, but not necessarily always. And we want to make sure that we're providing them the easiest pathway into the most depth that we can. So they don't want to go clicking forever or having to go do the research themselves. They want to be able to watch a video, scroll a little bit, or click one link and get a really deep amount of knowledge. And a lot of professional knowledge is kind of the goal. So that's one point. And then the 360 has a really good potential for educators. I think right now it's not used widely. And so it could be a really good and novel tool while we have it to be able to provide to students until, unfortunately, they're going to get bored of it and we'll have to come up with that next new thing. So that's sort of one of the realities we live with. And then realistically, the message I think is keep on fighting the good fight, right? As science educators, as educators, we live in really weird times right now. And understanding that the things we do does have an impact on the general public and does have an impact on the future is a really important thing to keep in your head and keep in your heart, right? Hope is one of those things that we have. And if you lose sight of that, then we kind of lose it all. And so I think that's kind of the ending message for me today. With that, maybe, oh, too far. With that, I'd like to acknowledge some folks. So Fort Leavenworth for the access. Neil Bass, who's our man on the ground at Fort Leavenworth, some of the other agencies that provided access to other areas, the Fort Leavenworth summer crew who either kept me sane or joined in my insanity. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have. Yeah.
Last or more or less forever, but like the video components, the 360 videos, things like that, how often do you anticipate those having to be updated?
So they can live kind of in perpetuity as long as whatever they're uploaded to stays. So the quality and that video will remain. As far as the information in that, that will have to be changed as that information changes. So taxonomically, if there are some changes, right, that will have to make a bit of a change. But the hope is that the project can be updated in the future to add different trees, to add more information to some of those trees. So
Something that anybody could
you could. So it's not open source, so you can't add to it. But if you were to talk to the base and say, hey, I think it'd be cool to do one on a Hackberry, you could create that and then upload it to the video. It's kind of a communication between the content creator, the administrator, and then just getting it on the website.
and it's hosted.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't very clear about that. So right now it's just built on Squarespace. And so we're going to be converting it over to a Fort Hays hosted website. So it will be hosted by Fort Hays and can be updated. Yeah. Yeah, Jason.
Great job.
Thank you.
Can I ask a weird question?
Yeah, of course. I like the weird ones.
Is there an aspect or a emotion or feeling that you get when you're doing in-person work like this that you feel technology has like not caught up to? Like, is there something if you had like unlimited money, unlimited time, and an army of silicon nuts to do your bidding, like what do you think is 30 years from now, what a student is going to be trying to be applying to conservation and education?
Yeah.
It's weird. Yeah.
30 years from now, it's tough. There's new technologies all the time. I do think that there is a little bit something missing when it comes to doing that direct interpretation. So, it's kind of the made with love model, right? If you make something with love, if you put your hand into it and you're there in person, it has more impact and you can kind of field questions a little better and the engagement's a little better. But obviously we're restricted by that. I don't know what technologies could be in the future. Right now, I think this is kind of where we're at and it's a good model. Otherwise, people are just continuing to use the traditional video format and just doing that kind of in different storytelling ways. So yeah, I'm not sure what the future holds, but I hope it could be engaging. Yeah, of course. Yeah, cool.
The question I have.
Yeah, of course.
You mentioned deep ecology early on,
Mhm.
and Arnie Ness and all his work, talked about our identities are tied to where we are. So something I'm curious about is how your identity has changed through the project, through your time on the ground.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I love that. So my identity has changed a lot, right? I'm originally from Colorado, grew up around mountains, grew up around trees, and then spent the next 15 years in the Great Plains in Western Kansas and saw maybe 5 different species of trees that were like kind of cool. So when I first visited Fort Leavenworth, it was like this real awe moment. I mean, they are really impressive forests, really impressive trees. The first branch for a lot of these is at like 40 feet, which is hard to like think about. And then we kind of came up with the project and I was like, well, I'm gonna have to climb these trees because I'm gonna have to get some of the fruits. So now I'm 60 feet up in these trees looking at this beautiful forest that is for Kansas untouched. And so as far as like my connection with it, it sort of changed to become a real tree lover in a sense, and want to tell those stories because they're new to me and novel to me, and I think they're very cool. Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah.
As a tree lover, I have a follow-up.
Yes.
So you did a wonderful job of trying to explain to a public audience, to an audience that you might have had the last biology course, either the last biology college course, either still ahead of them, yes, or many years in the past. So you're making a wonderful case of showing them a few select important tree species in these preserves. Now, as you of course know, the truth is a typical wood would not only contain more species than that, but there's always certain, unless you're really a plant taxonomist that digs deep into it, you could maybe confuse one species with another. There are several trees that look similar. You mentioned that shagbark hickory, that Carya ovata. There are 1 or 2 species that look very similar. I know the bark is distinct, but whether it was a Carya Oh, yeah, it says, you know,
That says, I know grass. I know grass.
Shell. Loci, I think that's the correct name, looks almost identical.
Mhm.
Goes all the way down to Texas, that's why I know it. Do you inform the reader there that, yes, very likely that's the species you're looking at, but to be honest, there's a little bit of muddiness in terms of the species identification, and there are many more species around than the 5, 6 that you introduced, again, in a very wonderful way, that you introduced to the reader.
Yeah. So
To the hike.
The pages that aren't just specific to the individual trees, so like the oaks and the hickories, they talk about more than just one oak or hickory species. In those pages, it says they're kind of the predominant oak species, or these are predominant hickory species. It's not an all-inclusive list. And there's also a web page of like helpful resources to be able to engage the public in doing the work themselves to identify other trees. And so there's some of the books actually that are up here, some identification books, Seek, the app Seek, and iNaturalist, to be able to go out and kind of explore those other species. It's not necessarily explicitly said that there could be other species, but it's kind of an understood thing that there are other tree species that you can go out and look for. But these are kind of the ones that we've chosen because they're pretty easily identifiable and kind of big and obvious. So hopefully that answers your question. Yeah.
Are they equally amenable to making casts of, or are there some, like, oh, these are so delicate, I can't really.
Yeah, if I had to cuss one, it'd be the pawpaw. Their leaves are relatively thin, and the fruit is very large. So in the casting process, we actually had the mold break out because the wax was just too big and too heavy when we were melting out. So that was one issue that I ran into with species-wise. And then I think it was black walnut as well. The leaflets, the way they're attached, they tend to pop off a little bit easier than some of the other compound species. And so when you're painting the wax, you have to really, really gingerly. And if the wax adheres to the thing underneath it, then you rip a leaf off and you have to start with a new leaf. So yeah, that one was pretty temperamental, was black walnut as well. Yeah. Yeah, so if you're interested, you can come upstairs to 244, and I'm giving a workshop on the 360 video. So if you want to learn like the technical aspects and go more in depth about kind of the skills that it takes and techniques that it takes to make the videos, you can come upstairs and join in that, and that'll be at 4:30ish. So you can take a little break and then kind of head up there and check that out if you'd like. So yeah, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.